Welcome to this afternoon's panel on managing global commons. How can Indian Ocean countries collaborate to best manage these shared resources? Now, I know that we are speaking to what appears to be an empty hall, but those that are here make up with quality, and therefore it's quality that matters. Thank you for coming. There's also a reason why I'm standing here before you instead of sitting there, and it's really to wake you up so that you can see me, and so that it's an after lunch session, and I'm deeply aware of the difficulties in listening to anyone immediately after lunch. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great privilege for me to be asked to moderate this afternoon's session at the Indian Ocean Conference 2024 here in Perth. The moderator is generally expected to be seen and not heard, but I have every intention of making myself heard throughout this panel, so you'll have to bear with me. Part of the reason is also that I've had the pleasure of serving in Australia, in Japan, in the United States, in India, so that makes me Mr. Quad, so to speak. If there were a bodybuilding competition, I would be registered as Mr. Quad. But also because I've served for many years on the other side, beyond the firewall, beyond the bamboo curtain in China as well. Now today, I'm going to begin by laying the ground initially by quoting a few historians and writers, and let me begin with Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahan, the great US thinker, who had said, "Whoever controls the Indian Ocean dominates Asia." This is a well-known quotation from Mahan. He also said, "This ocean is the key to the 7 seas in the 21st century. The destiny of the world will be decided in these waters." And frankly, in the 21st century, we are living that. There was also a great thinker from India, in fact, our first ambassador to China, a scholar and a naval strategist to boot. His name was Ambassador K.M. Panikkar. He had also said in his essay titled India and the Indian Ocean, in his very introductory paragraph of that essay, he had opined that India never lost her independence till she lost the command of the sea in the first decade of the 16th century. And he is considered quite prescient in his writings on the unfolding great power contestation that we see before ourselves at this very juncture. Even Halford Mackinder, the geographer, the British geographer, who generally thought of the world as an island with sea power depending on land bases, he too acknowledged in his essay on democratic ideals and realities that sea power inevitably has the last word in the rivalry with land power because of the unity of the oceans. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm reminded of the olive ridley turtle that we just saw, and we heard about that from, I think it was Mr. Nick Abraham who spoke at the very beginning. The olive ridley turtle actually represents the unity of the oceans. When you look at the entire range in which the turtle is found, you'll be surprised to see it really covers all the oceans: the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, and so therefore I think it's a very good symbol for this conference as well. Let me begin by stating the obvious, that the world is in flux. There is a great deal of uncertainty today in terms of the emerging global order. There is a great deal of contestation taking place, and I would say that these are best summarized in the 7 T's. All these words start with the letter T, and they are prone to contestation no matter which geography we are referring to. And particularly, this is a fact in the Indian Ocean. For example, trade is at the heart of contestation. Trade is also being weaponized today. Then there is the next T of technology. We have seen the weaponization of technology, the sanctions, the embargoes, the restrictions, export controls surrounding the entire discourse, 5G, artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth. Then there are the ubiquitous territorial disputes, and we see them all over the region. We have seen them in the East China Sea, we see them in the South China Sea. The Himalayas between India and China are also witnessing this contestation over territorial differences, and we see much of that also playing out as we look at the Western Indian Ocean towards Africa, particularly the West Asian region. There is also the T of terrorism, which also radiates through this unity of oceans from across the Indian Ocean all the way to the Pacific. But instead of uniting us in our fight against terrorism, it actually divides us today. For there are countries, even permanent members of the Security Council, that use technical holds to deny the public listing, UN listing of terrorists from the Jaish-e-Mohammed and the Lashkar-e-Toiba, and you're aware of that as well. Then there is the T of tenets and narratives as to whose governance is better, whose system of social, political, economic, and cultural governance is superior. And it pits the democracies and the liberal states against authoritarian and autocratic states today. We also see that all this results in a lack of transparency. There is change taking place. There is a shift in the balance of power. The Chinese economy has risen. The Chinese Navy is growing. But is it really transparent? I would say it's not transparent. And in fact, we can do a lot of bean counting with regard to presence, activities, resources, assets. We can count the number of ships, planes, tanks, but we cannot count intentions and motives unless there is dialogue, unless there is a certain degree of confidence building at the multilateral level. And that's absent. Therefore, there is lack of transparency. The last T is that of trust, or the utter lack of it. We have simply no trust today at the international level. Now, we've all seen how the rise of China is in fact one of the main features of the emerging world order. And we see that the world today is also contesting what we call exclusive economic zones. Under UNCLOS, for example, there is provision to claim extended economic zones. The United States of America has also claimed 500,000 square kilometers of extra territory in the oceans. And so we have that happening at the same time as the usual contestation that we see before us. And to my mind, in the Indian Ocean, and this is for the panelists to think over, we have contestation between what we would otherwise deem as friendly neighbors. Take, for example, the Maldives and Mauritius. They have a dispute over their exclusive economic zone, and then you have a dispute between the United States and Mauritius, particularly over the future of the Chagos archipelago and the future of Diego Garcia. And I dare say the Diego Garcia base would be quite instrumental in dealing with the challenge of a Chinese naval presence in the future in the Indian Ocean. Secondly, we also have this phenomena of illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing, IUU fishing. The region is awash with IUU fishing, and to my mind, much of this fishing can be attributed to a particular country. I don't have to again repeat as to which country this might be, but you'll take a guess. A very large number of Chinese fishing fleets are to be found in the Pacific Ocean, in Micronesia, Melanesia, Polynesia, but they're also to be found in the Indian Ocean. In the northern Indian Ocean, there is a lot of what you call unbridled fishing of squid. And although this takes place in international waters, it's really beyond the pale of the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission as regards location or content as to what exactly they're picking up there. And many of these fleets come in without their transponders switched on. The AIS system is switched off. There are what they call reefers, the refrigerated vessels that come and pick up a lot of stuff. So these are like factories, and this is also not covered by the Southern Indian Ocean Fisheries Agreement. So we've got a problem there. The third issue, to my mind, with regard to managing the global commons, especially in the Indian Ocean, pertains to deep seabed mining. We are all aware that, broadly speaking, when we look at a map, we see in the Pacific the Clarion-Clipperton zone, where there are a lot of deep sea resources like polymetallic nodules and thermal vents, rare earths. So there's a scrimmage for this, and we see that in the Indian Ocean, just off Madagascar, there is a ridge called the Rodrigues Ridge, and the International Seabed Authority has actually allocated a lot of acreage there to various countries. China's Comora is also present there, as it is present in the Pacific Ocean. But for me, the more complicating part is that the International Seabed Authority in Jamaica is actually usually short of funds, and it receives large donations from a particular country. And I think, therefore, one must look at how the rest of us fund the ISA appropriately so that it doesn't fall prey to all sorts of machinations. There is also a strange demand by Nauru in the Pacific, which has recently switched allegiance from Taiwan to the People's Republic of China, that within 2 years it wants the ISA to finalize the rules of the road for deep sea mining. And I'm not sure how this is going to work out, because the United States of America is not a member of the ISA. It's actually, as you know, signed but not ratified UNCLOS. It's not in the ISA, and if the US is not in the ISA, it really takes away one big country that supposedly can stave off Chinese pressure in the ISA to guide rules in a particular direction. So I think the US must do a little bit of a rethink there. The next point I want to present to them is, and this is not directly related to the Indian Ocean, but it's the looming issue of the Antarctic Treaty. Now, as you all know, the Indian Ocean is one of the key funnels through which you can actually create a base for future exploitation of the continent, the icebound continent of Antarctica. And while the treaty itself is not coming to an end anytime soon, in 2048 it will be up for a certain amount of reinterpretation by the Antarctic Treaty consultative parties. Those that will have a say include countries that are non-claimant, and by non-claimant I mean obviously countries like India and China. And so we need to see this in context, because if there are new rules that come up shaping the treaty for environmental protection of the Antarctic Treaty, we may find countries that are already exploiting the krill there, that are creating a fifth station there, that are likely to monitor naval and other missile activity from Antarctica, actually creating more problems for the rest of us. I also want the panel to think closely about AUKUS Pillar 2. Now, AUKUS Pillar 2 speaks about cyber, artificial intelligence, quantum, and undersea capabilities. At least the first 4 of these, cyber, AI, quantum, and undersea capabilities, are things on which the Pillar 2 of AUKUS, which is not strictly in the Indian Ocean, can work with Indian Ocean littoral countries, in my view. And they could perhaps do this through Quad or Quad Plus. The next is space, where I believe that the Asia-Pacific regional space agency forum, which is run by Japan since 1983, that's the best one, APRSAF, for all of us to come together and work. And why should we work together with regard to space in the Indian Ocean? I believe there is a problem with space debris as well. The low Earth orbit is awash with about 7,000 satellites, about 5,000 of them active, at least 2,000 inactive, and there are all sorts of debris that are falling into the Indian Ocean. I can cite at least 3 examples in the last 3 years where parts of the Long March 5B rocket weighing up to 6, 7, 8 tons have fallen into the Indian Ocean in an uncontrolled manner. And so we need to do something about that as well. Piracy is an issue, so we must look at piracy as well in terms of the renewed incidence of piracy in the Arabian Sea not yet in the Indian Ocean, but at the mouth of the Red Sea. And this has, of course, political reasons as well. On the one hand, the situation in West Asia. On the other hand, the Houthi attacks against merchant shipping, especially passing through the Bab al-Mandab. So we must look at all this and more. Now I shall resume my seat there and allow the panel to have their say as well. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. So we have a wonderful cast here today. I'm very quickly going to run through their names. We have Mr. Sindarpal Singh, a senior fellow with the South Asia Program, Assistant Director of the Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies from Singapore. Then we have Dr. Frederic Grard, who is a Senior Research Fellow. He is French, but is currently stationed in Canberra. He is Senior Research Fellow at the National Security College in Canberra. We have Ms. Jacqueline Espinilla, or Espinilla, if you pronounce it in Spanish, is an Assistant Professor at the UP College of Law and a Research Fellow at the UP Institute for Maritime Affairs. She, by the way, has worked on the BBNJ treaty, that is the High Seas Treaty that was signed last year, and perhaps she will speak about that as well. We have Mr. Manmohan Parkas from the ADB, rich experience there, 32 years. And then we have Dr. Russell Reichelt, who is a fellow of the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering, and he is essentially the Australian Sherpa for the Climate Change Authority and negotiations in that regard. And so, turning back to my questions here, I would like to begin with, may I do it in reverse order? So all of you have about 7 minutes, and if you want to take a cue from me, you might even speak a little more, a minute or two more. Dr. Sindarpal Singh, given this indivisibility of the oceans, which I touched upon, the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, and the Pacific, given the fact that the sea lanes of communication, the SLOCs are intermeshed, drug smuggling, piracy, money laundering, and organized crime. I mean, all this can provide a new core for our cooperation in the Indian Ocean, because if we don't manage these issues, how on earth are we going to manage the global commons in the Indian Ocean? A penny for your thoughts.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I want to thank everyone who's here. I want to thank India Foundation and the Perth USA Center for having us here. The Rajaratnam School has been a co-organizer of the IOC since 2016, so it's great to be back here again. So the Chair asked me a few questions. I actually prepared a 5-minute thing, but so maybe I try to answer your question. I think the question that you posed sort of fits into the question that came to me, is about how India and Southeast Asia can try to cooperate given what you broadly outlined. I think the discussions over maritime domain awareness has become a big debate in academic circles, in policy circles. And on the surface, it looks like something where people cannot disagree. Maritime domain awareness seems to be one of those things where on the surface it's a very good thing, everyone can agree, you share information. However, I think there are certain issues that need to be addressed when it comes to maritime domain awareness. The first is this term, if it's capitalized, MDA, it becomes a problem. If it's small letters, it's not a problem. Let me explain why. Big capital letters MDA is still a term that is, for at least for Southeast Asian countries, politically loaded, given that its genesis is within the kind of US policy speak. That's where it came from, right? And I think the very enthusiastic articulation of MDA initiatives by Quad countries, by European countries, makes ASEAN countries seem even a bit more reticent about the term and what the implications are. And related to the first point, the concern over MDA is what exactly does it mean? And we keep sometimes hearing that MDA is also about intelligence sharing. For ASEAN countries, this is something a step too far. Right? Information sharing and intelligence sharing are two different things. And for ASEAN countries, I think the intelligence sharing is something that it makes them nervous. So I think that, again, you need to think about how MDA is done and what exactly what kind of MDA you're doing. The third issue, I guess, in trying to use MDA as a way to foster another broad cooperation between India and Southeast Asia in the kind of non-traditional domain is the need, at least from the ASEAN or the Southeast Asian perspective, that MDA initiatives need to be inclusive, right? And MDA initiatives should leave the door open for all ASEAN countries and ASEAN partners. And related to this, there's a need to project MDA as part of provision of public goods, not as some kind of part of a larger geostrategic project, against one or other country. So I think that's where I think the MDA debate is there's still a lot, there's a significant gulf between India and, in this case, Southeast Asia, in talking about MDA. And related to this, you mentioned all the issues when it comes to IUU fishing, etc. I think the one point I want to make is, over the last, I think, few years especially, if you're an analyst, it becomes very difficult now, analytically, to make the different, or to think about what the difference is between traditional and non-traditional security anymore, right? There was a time where there was enough of a gulf between analyzing traditional and non-traditional security. That gulf has narrowed. And the implications of that are, following on from there, and I think you, sir, articulated the view. The view is that the key threat here is China, right? The view is that Chinese, like you say, distant fleet vessels are involved in IUU fishing, and this is not my view, I'm just articulating what I think of view out there, and therefore this is part of a wider approach by the Chinese state to push back against rules, against norms governing the maritime space. I think we need to take a step back and think carefully about this, because if you really look at the data, not much available, but the data that's available, when it comes to IUU fishing especially, China is not the only culprit here. In fact, in certain indicators, there are various other Asian and European countries who come close in terms of being perpetrators or culprits when it comes to IUU fishing. So I think there's again a dissonance between what is a view that is held among large sections of people, and also what the data says. So I think if you cannot identify the problem properly, then you cannot solve it properly. So I think that's, and my last point is, people talk about realistic policy options, and sometimes it's very difficult to think about realistic options. And one view that keeps coming across is, given the increased securitization of non-traditional security threats, the only way you're going to make headway is at the higher level, which is you should look at US-China geostrategic competition and see how you can try to bring it down a notch, right? And third countries have been involved in this a lot. Singapore, for example, has been at the forefront of trying to provide avenues for the US and China to talk. I'm not saying this is going to be solved overnight, but to try to talk to people and see which parts you can de-securitize. So the Shangri-La Dialogue is one. We at the Rajaratnam School hold something called a trilateral discussions where we get Chinese academics and American academics to come to Singapore and try to find ways in where you can find areas where you can slowly de-securitize. Right? So that's one way in which you can do it. I think I'll stop there, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Singh, for your informative remarks, and also for pointing out the obvious, which is that the traditional and non-traditional security issues are today fused like never before. But there's a peculiarity in the area, the Southeast Asian region, that you represent, and that is that there is a draft code of conduct that is being attempted, and it's been attempted for the last 22 years, if I recall correctly, all the way back in 2002. It was that the draft code of conduct first was mooted, and it's still in draft form. The other problem is that it's only the 10 ASEAN countries and China that are talking about managing the global commons there. But whatever decision you take will deeply affect the rest of us. And so isn't there a case here for the rest of us also to be consulted? Since the sea lines of communication, the sea lanes pass through seamlessly from the Indian Ocean through the Malacca or through the Sunda, Lombok or Mumbai-Vetar Straits onto the Pacific. So what happens in one ocean has a direct impact on the other oceans. So I think you might like to ponder over that suggestion as well. Can the Quad consult the Southeast Asian countries about this? Can others be consulted from the Indian Ocean region as well, since much of our trade passes through the same region? I now turn to Dr. Frederick Graar. What, in your view, would be the regional security architecture required to better protect and manage the global commons in the Indian Ocean region?
Well, this is a vast question, and I'm not sure that we should really distinguish between the common per se. There are a number of texts which apply specifically to the commons and BBNG that my neighbor is going to speak about, with, I'm sure, a lot of more talent than I will ever be capable of, is one aspect of it. But I mean, the real problem that we face is a problem of governance of the oceans, and there we go, and the lines there are increasingly being blurred. The one topic that I intended to speak about was fisheries, and this is increasingly difficult to distinguish between the two. My other neighbor, Surinder Singh, spoke of IU fishing. IU fishing is done for 95% in EEZ, yet when you look at the way things are being done, the mother fish are being based in the international waters, and the ships actually conducting the operation are operating in the EEZ. So this line between, and there are a number of reasons that explain why the lines are incredibly blurred. If we look at the larger security issue, this is even worse than that, but I won't get into that. What I want to speak slightly about is this governance issue, which is definitely lacking. This is lacking because of a number of problems. First of all, loopholes in international regulation. You spoke of the common. The number of species which are regulated by international norms, for example, in the commons, are only tunas and tuna-like species, and that's about it. Now, that opens a lot of way for other species to be fished. I'm talking of cephalopod, which has a direct impact on whatever is being done with the tunas and so on and so forth. So that's one aspect of it. The second is, whenever the norms exist, they are unevenly integrated in the national legislation. I mean, even when those norms, in all good faith, are trying to be integrated, this is not the case. I mean, you take a country like South Africa and the Comoros, just to mention the southwest part of the Indian Ocean, and you are talking of the two extremes in the region, with very strong integration in South Africa, with a very weak integration in the Comoros, for a number of reasons which have to do with capacities and so on. But this is also a reality. The third is the fragmentation of the governance framework. What is absolutely striking when we speak of fisheries, there is not a single organization which reunite all the stakeholders and all the species. That's something which is striking, because if you accept the distinction that I was making at the very beginning of this conversation on various parts of the food chain, then this makes absolutely no sense. And this opened a lot of room for a number of fleet of external powers to come in and start doing things that they were not supposed to do at the beginning. force the adherence to and compliance with regional and international arrangements. A number of international arrangements exist, but look, for example, at how many states in South Asia have signed the port measure agreements. India is not part of it. India is a big actor in the region, which everybody look at for a number of things. It's not part of it. The only states in the region which have actually signed to it are Bangladesh, Maldives, and Sri Lanka. In the Gulf, since we speak of the entire Indian Ocean, Oman only. The almost entire East African coast, with the exception, I believe, of Kenya, I signed for it. Yet, this introduced a number of discrepancies that are significant and do not help provide us a large and comprehensive view of the problem. The capacity issue. I mean, we spent, for those of you who attended the Blue Maritime Economy session this morning, there are a number of reasons, a number of fields in which this capacity issue is being discussed through. But I mean, if we just speak of governance, the action of the state at sea, I mean, there are vast discrepancies between the capacity of a state like India on the one side, let's say Tanzania, or Mozambique on the other one. And I'm not mentioning those two states by coincidence, because they have been cooperating in some exercises recently in the Indian Ocean. So, you know, all those things combined helps explain why things do not work. And issues like corruption everywhere do explain also a lot of what is happening at sea. I mean, when you cite for a number of licenses and end up having 10 times the number of ships that your number of license will allow, there is a problem there, and this is not coincidence. So that's where we stand in the Indian Ocean, and this is a fact that this is the least governed ocean in the world. So there we are. Now, if you want to speak about the solution to that, you just name it, and you do have.
So who, in your view, should be taking the lead in this regard? Because
it's not about
my problem, which I pose to you, is that there's a lot of squid in the central Indian Ocean, the northern part, which is in international waters, and it's being depleted at a tremendous rate. Now, squid actually may appear low in the food chain, but it is very much part of the tuna's dinner. And if you don't have enough squid, you don't have enough tuna. And so what can the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission do about that?
No, but
they're not fishing for tuna, but they're fishing for squid, these illegal fleets.
But precisely, this is a species which is not regulated yet. So if you want to do that, you have to enlarge the mandate of existing organizations. I mean, it would definitely help a lot if the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission had its mandate extended to a series of new species, which makes sense in the context that we're speaking about. That's one aspect of it. I mean, the fact is we also don't have a proper view of what's going on in the Indian Ocean. There is not a single institution which collects all the data and is able to give all the littoral state a proper view of what the state, the situation is in the Indian Ocean. So that's the second aspect of it. It's not so much who should have the lead. I mean, this is a collective effort. It could be initiated as much by the FAO.
What kind of structures would you recommend? For example, in the Indian Ocean, we have the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, which is an initiative of the Indian Navy, has now taken on a momentum of its own. You have the Indian Ocean Rim Association, IORA, but they are not really, making rules for against illegal or overfishing and things like that.
If we speak of the architecture, we have to speak of a series of things, and there is clearly a disconnect between what is desirable and what is feasible in the short term. I mean, we can dream of the ideal architecture. This is not going to happen tomorrow. We could easily, on the contrary, imagine that one specific institution be charged of the scientific monitoring of the Indian Ocean with a series of branches, networks, and so on. This is something which has been discussed earlier. This is something which makes a lot of sense. But so far, it doesn't exist. Second, what kind of problem are we talking about? If we speak of uneven regulation and so on, if we speak, as somebody was saying this morning, of the literacy about the problem, institutions like IOI could do the job. But IOI is ill-equipped to do anything else right now, so this is another thing. If we speak number of the capacity of action of the state at sea, this is a different thing. But I don't think that the Navy, the IONS, is the right thing, because this is not a political body, this is a forum of the Chief of Navy. So, you know, that has to be somewhere else. Could we think, and that's a question mark and definitely not proposal, can we think of something that would resemble, for example, for the Indian Ocean, what CCAT is in the South China Sea? Well, that's perhaps an idea that could be explored, maybe not exactly under the same form. The idea would be to prop up capabilities. Now, there is this last question as, where are the capacities? You have a serious problem with a number of African problems. We have a serious problem in a number of littoral states in general in the problem. Now, you can speak of mutualization. Mutualization go as far as capacity exists. There is a stage at which mutualization becomes dilution of the capacities. Then can we think of programs not so much of giving to littoral states or island states ships which have been decommissioned in other countries, because that creates a lot of other problems and is not even less expensive for the recipient state. But what about the equivalent for the Indian Ocean of a program like Ship Rider that the Americans created for the Pacific, and which seems to be working fairly well? I don't know under which specific circumstances, under which form that could exist, but these are different levels of the problems that could be addressed by different institutions, yet still feasible in the context that we know, even though there is an additional step to make.
Thank you. I think we also need to keep in mind that as far as IUU fishing in the Pacific is concerned, there is in fact a bit of a pushback coming from countries like Ecuador, Peru, and particularly Argentina against such rampant and illegal fishing in their waters. And I wonder if that's going to cause some of these fleets, and you know which fleets I mean here, to wind their way into the Indian Ocean, because as you said, it's a less governed space, you know. But we can come back to that again. Let me at this stage also point out that whether for fishing or for deep seabed mining, any presence is actually a toehold for creating a bigger presence, such as a naval presence, and you know, operational turnaround and providing supplies, etc. So usually it's the thin end of the wedge. Any kind of large-scale fishing militia presence or large-scale deep-sea mining presence. One thing leads to the other, and I think in the Indian Ocean we have to keep our eyes open for that. I now turn to, and I come back again to all of you, to Jacqueline Espinilla. What do you think are the international legal mechanisms needed to manage better these global commons in the Indian Ocean? Keep in mind the fact that the United States, for example, has signed but not ratified UNCLOS, and yet respects it, more than some countries that have signed and ratified them. By that I mean the People's Republic of China, that has signed and ratified UNCLOS, but then does not observe that, as many observers would say, in either letter or in spirit. And so when you have major countries missing from the discourse, how do you get that legal mechanism to work? In your own country's case, you've seen how the tribunal of UNCLOS that looked at your country's territorial dispute with China took a certain view in favor of the Philippines, but that award was summarily and peremptorily thrown out by the other party. So how do you do rule enforcement? As I mentioned earlier, in the International Seabed Authority, the Americans are not there. And so if rules have to be made by the ISA in the next 2 years, as demanded by Nauru, for deep sea mining, and it might start before you know it. And what is the devastation that it will cause to the oceans, to furthering acidification of the oceans, or pollution, or spreading more poisons that we have not even dealt with coming up from the depths of the oceans. How are you going to do this?
Right. Thank you very much for those very interesting and thought-provoking questions. I'll address them at the end of my presentation, just for a little bit of structure. So as has already been mentioned, I'm from the Philippines, and to be perfectly honest, the Indian Ocean isn't necessarily my wheelhouse. I'm much more concerned with bodies of water closer to home, South China Sea in particular. However, what both the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean have in common is that they are both semi-enclosed by land masses and islands, but at different scales. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the resulting configuration of EEZs around these waters produces pockets of high seas and deep seabed areas which lie beyond the jurisdiction of any state. Therefore, the middle of the Indian Ocean is effectively global commons which may be accessed and used by any country. This characterization does come at a cost. Unfortunately, ABNJ are poorly governed by a patchwork of multilateral treaties and arrangements, as I think has already been pointed out by my esteemed colleagues here. So this results in regulatory gaps and overlaps. And this means that there's also a sense that the ABNJ is a sort of free-for-all, resulting in the overuse of the space and overexploitation of resources through fisheries, marine pollution, vessel traffic, etc. In June last year, a new treaty was just adopted by the UN as an implementing agreement of the UNCLOS. This is the BBNJ agreement, and it is the product of over 20 years of discussions and complex negotiations. This treaty has numerous elements, but given the time, I will just focus on one aspect of it. And this is the establishment of area-based management tools, including marine protected areas. ABMTs are defined under the BBNJ agreement as tools for a geographically defined area through which one or several sectors or activities are managed with the aim of achieving particular conservation and sustainable use objectives. Even this basic definition of the ABMT was a contentious point throughout, as to a sort of cobbled together from the existing definitions under other instruments. But in any case, this is a definition that we now subscribe to. One example of an ABMT, and perhaps the most common one, are MPAs, and high seas MPAs in particular under the context of this agreement. It is a crucial way to help achieve the goals set in the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework under the Convention of Biological Diversity. The goal here is to protect 30% of the world's oceans by 2030. Now, if you look at the BBNJ agreement, you will see that it provides for a multi-stage process for ABMT designation. First, the proposal stage, where state parties can identify and propose areas which will be covered by an area-based management tool. These proposals should be based on the best available science and, where available, relevant traditional knowledge and indigenous peoples and local communities, taking into account the precautionary approach and the ecosystem approach. During the negotiations, there were debates about the geographic scope of ABMTs in relation to disputed maritime areas. I think what has to be very clear is that ABMTs may only be established in ABNJ as understood under the UNCLOS, seeing as the BBNJ agreement is an UNCLOS implementing agreement, and consistency, of course, between these two instruments is absolutely desired. Otherwise, we could end up with situations where high seas under the UNCLOS would be considered as off-limits to the establishment of ABMTs if even one country claims sovereignty over the said area. So, second step in the process is the review and the consultation on the proposals. The proposals are submitted for review to the scientific and technical body established under this agreement, and the Secretariat will then make the proposals publicly available to all relevant stakeholders for the input. A quick comment here, the BBNJ agreement is quite notable in that it really does implement throughout the instrument a sort of sunshine policy, wherein transparency is highly encouraged throughout all dimensions of the agreement. So, in relation to this idea of consultation, it's very important to consider who precisely are the stakeholders who would be allowed to participate in this process. This phrase covers adjacent coastal states and global, regional, sub-regional, and sectoral bodies, including regional fisheries management organizations, and notably civil society, the scientific community, and indigenous peoples. It's quite interesting, really, to see the place of honor given to non-traditional voices in international law, something, if you notice, is not really all too often hard-coded in international treaties. One other interesting provision in this part deals with cases where the proposed measure affects areas that are entirely surrounded by the EEZs of states. Here, the proponent is required to undertake not just consultations, but targeted and proactive consultations, including prior notification by with those surrounding states. This is due to the fact that their proximity and ecological connectivity makes them especially vulnerable to any measures taken in the high seas. Third, the establishment of the ABMT by the Conference of Parties, or the COP. Here, the COP must be mindful not to undermine, and this is a phrase that you will see again used quite liberally throughout the instrument. They must not undermine any measures done by any adjacent states in respect to measures done by those states within their national jurisdiction. The COP must also be mindful not to undermine and respect the competences of relevant IFPs. As I often point out when asked to speak on this topic, is that the BBNJ agreement springs into a world wherein there is already an existing family, an existing network of related instruments. So it does not arrive to a whiteboard where it could just basically create new rules. It has to take into consideration how it will adopt and interact with those existing instruments, frameworks, and bodies. However, the phrase "not to undermine" throughout the negotiations was left to be quite ambiguous. It was an issue that was contentious and was parked to be discussed at a later point by the COP. It could range in interpretation from full deference, meaning by the COP, the BBNJ COP will merely recognize and adopt and follow the lead of these existing IFBs insofar as the designation of ABMTs, or it could be something else entirely, meaning they will just take complementary action or completely ignore. So there are a range of actions that they could take in relation to this. Under the BBNJ agreement, decisions of the COP will be taken by consensus, which would ordinarily mean that no ABMT can be established if even a single state party objects to it. To avoid that, decisions and recommendations can now be done by a 3/4 majority of the parties present and voting if consensus really could not be achieved. There will thus be a higher probability that an ABMT can actually push through because now it will not be a tyranny of the minority. So there is a likelihood of that. Sort of to counterbalance that, there are also included opt-out provisions for states who really have strong objections or valid grounds for not recognizing the designation of an ABMT. And then there are very specific grounds that can be recognized for that purpose. And finally, implementation, monitoring, and review. A lot here depends on the capacity of states in actually fully recognizing and implementing those ABMTs, which makes the capacity development and transfer of marine technology provisions of the BBNJ that much more important. Communication and coordination with relevant IFBs will also be quite crucial. Now, this process, I took the time to go through because these are interesting things to think about, because just by going on environmental criteria alone, there are at least 2 potential areas in the Indian Ocean for such high seas MPAs: the Mascarene Plateau near Seychelles and Mauritius, and the Arabian Sea, or parts of the Arabian Sea rather. So in the very near future, it could be that this will actually be a real concern, a real possibility for this part of the world. So what can Indian Ocean countries do at this point? It's very simple. Sign the treaty and ratify it. At the moment, the treaty has already been open for signature as of September 2023, and will be open for signature all the way to 2025. Afterwards, states can still become state parties via accession. The treaty will enter into force 120 days after the 60th instrument for ratification or accession has been deposited. But a lot of things needs to be done domestically as well. It varies from country to country, but I imagine it will require domestic legislation and getting necessary government buy-in to prepare for the implementation. And because we are science-based for purposes of the ABMT designation, a lot of scientific work needs to be done in order to underpin the future ABMT and satisfy the criteria for making those designations and area identification. Now, in answer to your question, Mr. Moderator, the problem with not having every single country buy into an agreement is that, of course, there's always a threat of undermining the very purpose of that agreement. But all instruments are intended to be entered or negotiated with a hopeful mindset. I was fortunate enough to participate in these negotiations for the BBNJ agreement. And what I saw was active participation from all states, including China, including the United States, and all the major powers who presumably would have a significant sway insofar its ultimate effectivity. It tells me that there is really a recognition that the protection of the high seas and the deep seabed areas is something that has to be done, and urgently. So now we are waiting for the process of adoption of these instruments. And I think right now it's looking very well, and we are on track for it to take place. We note that because of the interventions made by many of these key players, key actors, we can already see the sense of the direction that they're taking and the position that they're adopting with respect to this instrument. And it seems that the support is there. So at present, I am cautiously optimistic that it will not necessarily have the same sort of standoff that UNCLOS did at the time between the developed and developing states. This seems to be a little bit better.
I think it's good to be optimistic.
Yeah.
And I must congratulate you also for the work that you seem to have done with regard to the High Seas Treaty. But as the term suggests, it's marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. So I'm obviously obliged to also take a hard look at the emerging or potential differences under UNCLOS with regard to the extended exclusive economic zone running parallel with this treaty. At some point, there would be renewed friction again, because there would be a redefinition of national jurisdiction. Yep. So anyway, you can ponder about that. But bringing the discourse back to the Indian Ocean, I think there is an issue with building consensus, because if you have disputes over the EEZ between ostensibly friendly countries like the Maldives and Mauritius, or Mauritius and the United States of America, then how do we build consensus? Now take a look at the dispute between Mauritius and the United States. The matter went to the UN General Assembly. A country like India has supported Mauritius, not the United States of America, though the US is our strategic partner and one with which we do a lot of business. And when it goes to, for example, the International Court of Justice, again, you find that the consensus expected between like-minded partners with shared values is, in fact, broken. So there is an issue here, and we need to take a hard look at it. I now turn to Mr. Manmohan Prakash. You represent the ADB. The ADB is traditionally known for lending finance to countries for sustainable development, and I'm sure that you also look at small island nations, developing countries. And I know you have a presence in Bangladesh and the Maldives as well. But what do you think is the role that the ADB can play in better managing the global commons on our side, in the sense, in the Indian Ocean, not so much in Southeast Asia? And do tell me your thoughts about how the ADB would have to compete for affection with, if I can use that term, with China's Belt and Road Initiative and the easy developmental finance available there, or for that matter, the parallel structures, international structures created in recent years, such as the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank or the New Development Bank or the BRICS. Where does that leave the ADB?
No, thank you very much. I think global commons, just the name suggests, it's a common asset. Everybody seems to own it, but nobody seems to really take the responsibility for it. And from the MDB's perspective, if I may take, I think that's an area where it has an absolutely big role to play. If we look at the discussion, I think there have been a large number of treaties, there have been a lot of discussion, but the fact is that the movement on the field or ground level has been quite not so significant, let me use a better word. So there actually MDBs can come in and play a role of facilitating dialogue, of giving some research studies, grants, which can start this entire process. That's the first thing. The second is there are these national plans which are developed by countries. If they can fit into some kind of an architecture, because each of the countries, when they contribute to their own national plans, will lead to impacts in the high seas. And I take the example of Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a riverine country which has large number of rivers flowing into the delta, into the sea. So they have developed this Delta Plan 2100, Delta Plan 2100, which is a futuristic plan. But what it helps is the Bay of Bengal, which was traditionally an area which benefited a lot from the ocean trade, seems to have lost the story sometime around 50, 60, 70 years ago. And they would want it to come back. So what happens in these countries which are along this corridor is equally important. The second part, and I think that's where the problem is, that there is a lot of talk, but not enough money available for taking up several of the opportunities that can showcase that what is possible and how each one of us can benefit. There, these national plans can help us to bring in finance, but more importantly, MDBs can also bring in low-cost, long-term financing. This financing comes at a very, very cheap and a very reasonable cost, but it also comes with certain restrictions where the money is spent for its intended purposes. A lot of times what we are finding that public funds are being spent, but then the results are not coming. And there the MDBs have come in and they have ensured through a proper mechanism of monitoring and ensuring that you get quality infrastructure, you are able to reap the benefits of those investments. Another area where MDBs can come in or where ADB and others can help is the introduction of the new technologies, the research studies that are undertaken, and bringing the discussion that is happening in some of the areas of the scientific community to pilot test projects, to bring in new concepts, to also demonstrate what have been the impacts of some of these actions that have been taken. I'm sure there are several case studies where good results have fallen, but unfortunately, they have not translated into replication, they have not translated into actions that can be then done by some other countries. So
do you have a mechanism where you do feasibility studies keeping in mind the competition as well?
That's right. So I think for our side, from a ADB's development perspective, the first part of us is really a project concept, then developing a pre-feasibility study, a more detailed engineering design or a more detailed feasibility study, and looking at the viability. An interesting part this morning was about the railway corridor that somebody had mentioned, one of the panelists. Now, an alternative analysis is very important, where you see that if I was to construct a road, what will be the life cycle cost, what will be its impact, vis-a-vis a sea corridor or a rail corridor, how it would be. So those are the kind of things, and quite frankly, MDBs can play the role of an honest broker. Now, we haven't done it in this effect of C.
When you loosely refer to MDB, I assume you are limiting yourself to the ADB.
Yeah.
That
World Bank, ADB.
Because we are not in the G20 convinced that the IMF and the World Bank, that the multilateral development banks and the international financial institutions have really reformed. But I take your word when it comes to the ADB.
Maybe that's a different discussion, but what I would say is that from the ADB's perspective, the Greater Mekong Sub-Region cooperation that happened, or the Central Asia Regional Economic Cooperation, has led to a huge economic opportunity being created for the people who were not benefiting from it. And I think a similar model can come into this space because there are small island states, there are certain countries who have a desire or who aspire to benefit but are unable to do. But if we are able to bring people along a table and we are able to also bring finance, affordable finance, some of these benefits could accrue.
So like the Prime Minister of India at COP26 in Glasgow had spoken of IRIS. You heard of IRIS?
Yes.
Infrastructure for Resilient Island States.
Yes.
Is there something happening there with the ADB?
Yeah.
Specifically with regard to the Indian Ocean?
Yes, so this is called co-financing. What we do is if there are certain viable projects, good projects, we bring in our money, we support the local, it's called blended finance. What is blended finance is that some of the funds that we have are grant funds or are funds given for long term, like 30-year, 40-year with let's say 1% or 1.5% rate of interest. And then there are bilaterals who come in with some finance. Australia, New Zealand, they give a lot of money, and we work together to really bring down the cost of funding and also help design projects that can give the results that are intended. So there are.
Is there any intermeshing between your loans and lines of credit that the likes of India would have given to countries in the neighborhood?
Yes. So
Is there an overlap there?
No,
But do you also have an overlap with the BRI?
BRI, I mean, again,
I shudder at that thought.
no, see, we do not say no to good projects, viable projects, but we certainly don't get influenced by some projects which are not viable. So I think we have our own mechanism of really doing our due diligence process, which covers environment, social, financial viability, economic viability, and based on that only we do the financing. Specific to some, like the India's case, so Bangladesh, Maldives, Bhutan, Nepal, we have shared several of the projects where the financing has come from some of the bilaterals within the region.
Thank you. You know, this morning there were two sessions. There was one taking place here. It was on climate change in this warm room. And then there was a dialogue and discourse in the other room on the blue economy. And that somehow was a very cold and frigid room there. But I think both are equally important. We, by the way, are seamlessly segueing from both those, blue economy, climate change, into the larger management of the global commons, with specific reference to the Indian Ocean. I know you are an expert, Dr. Russell Reichelt. So the whole idea is to know from you, how can we actually build a sustainable ocean economy in the Indian Ocean? Everybody has their plans for a blue economy today. There's not a single country that I know of in our region that doesn't speak of a blue economy, and millions depend on it. And especially in the coastal areas, they sometimes suffer doubly from rise of ocean levels, but they also suffer because if they are like Southeast Asian countries that depend, as also Australia, on tourism, and their coastal reefs are bleaching and there are problems, then you are looking at economic downturn as well. But you're also looking at roughly 25% of global fishery disappearing, because I'm told coastal reefs are home to 25% of all marine life. So I'd like to hear you. Can you link up this topic of climate change with the challenges of the Indian Ocean in particular?
Okay, thanks, Sujan. Let's just quickly realize, we have to realize the context, and I wanted everyone to cheer up a bit, that before UNCLOS, there was chaos, there wasn't a rule of order. We talk about rules-based order, but there wasn't really. It was power of the occupier, or the whatever, the pirate in the case of Elizabeth I, Drake. So, when you think about UNCLOS, I had the pleasure of bumping into and meeting briefly Professor Tommy Koh in Singapore, who chaired UNCLOS III. And I asked him, what do you think was the achievement of UNCLOS? Was it the economic zones, or what was it? And he said, well, you have to realise that there was no respect for, we'd just come back from a global conflict of horrendous proportions in World War II. And Arvid Pardo and others, there was a series of conferences, and he said that the law of the sea was the biggest rewriting of territoriality since the rise of the nation state. And he added that the purpose in his mind was to prevent future wars. So in a sense, we could be in much worse position now than had we not reached at least that agreement, but we haven't quite got to perfection. So that's my cheery message on UNCLOS. But you think about some of the things. Remember Einstein said, if you keep running the experiment and it does the same thing, well, maybe you need to rethink your experiment. The Indian Ocean Tuna Commission came into force nearly 30 years ago in '96, and it's now 29 members. There's been a lot of work done, and I think why have we seen more rapid change in the Pacific? And I think it's because some of the world powers had much stronger fishing interests there, and the US had a multilateral treaty with South Pacific. The EEZs are more or less for the 22 forum countries touch each other except for the donut holes. It's a more coherent thing. The issues are at the boundary, and some of the, at that time, the distant water nations were Japan. Post-World War II, they began an expansion of tuna fishing to it rapidly expanded in the 40s, and by 59 they were at 60 degrees south catching southern bluefin tuna. You can make a map of it, and it's all Japan Fisheries data. They give us that. So all I'm saying is there's been a lot of changes. Let's bring it to today. And the changes that I see in the Indian Ocean in some ways mirror what we're seeing now and measuring in the Pacific, where the climate change, the hotspots in the ocean. Let's put aside acidification and the billions of tons of things that the squid eat to feed the tuna, which I don't like acid. So I think you alluded to that. Let's just think about the hotspots, which my colleague Tony Warby was here this morning. The CSIRO and others in the Pacific have mapped these hotspots. They're not just the Barrier Reef, they're not just the Lakshadweeps, you know, they're all over all oceans, and they're very serious, and they affect fisheries production. And I read a paper this morning in the, what's it called, the Journal of Maritime Science and Engineering, and it was about the hotspots off East Africa changing fisheries productivity, and it was directly proportional. The rise of heat, the loss of fish, was to the intensity of piracy. So so it's changing the behaviour of local people, and again, that's been mentioned here already. So what I'm saying is that there's been lessons from elsewhere. We're seeing a lesson now in the militarisation of fisheries control vessels in the Eastern Pacific, that was mentioned too, with China has a it's now the biggest distant water fishing fleet in the world.
I believe Argentina actually fired some shots at
Have they exchanged?
some of these, not exchanged, I hope not,
Yeah.
but that could well be true because they're fishing militias.
Well, Argentina is concerned, but these were around the Galapagos, which is near the equator. Chile's concerned because I was there last September talking to them about it. So we're seeing these, if we've got a rules-based order, not everybody either knows or respects the rules. So what are we going to do about that? And this is a hypothesis that I dreamed up while I was listening to my colleague at the other end, so it's well thought out. I've had 5 speakers, is that I think we need systemic change in our economy, in our multilateral banks. We've already seen the Green Climate Fund, we had his deputy at one of our Sherpa meetings say that we will be the first loss takers. That's a huge thing to offer a co-investor. Some of the big Asian Development Bank, Bill Gates, whoever it is, if you've got a first loser, if it goes bad, then so we're hearing a change in how the financial system does business, and I should say, in defence of my colleague, Asian Development Bank is seen as a world leader in this, so I'll back him up. So we need to capitalise this systemic change. We need to change how we deal with coastal people, and I'll finish on that in a second, but I want to take you through, what are we talking about? Quickly, it's food security, it's food resources, it's not just a rules-based order, but a compliance of rules-based orders. And that's in the fisheries, and you know, in Fiji and further east, fishing revenue was more than 50% of their GDP before COVID. We're not talking about a side industry; it's their livelihood, and sometimes it's mostly export for them. The land-sea connections, pollution was what triggered some of the law of the sea with Pardo, the plastic pollution Thor Heyerdahl saw on his journey. And his son explained it to me through his book. The blue carbon issue is everywhere now. We used to call it productive coastal fisheries habitat, then it was mangrove swamp, then now it's blue carbon. But it's very important for all the reasons. And some of the coastal areas in Tamil Nadu where I've done work, there's very progressive policies. Don't build within 500 metres of the coast. And a friend of mine, a young scientist there, has used local knowledge, local fishing people and convinced his regional government to make a dugong sanctuary because he was able to work with the local people and explain that the reason they were catching fish further out, past where the dugong are, was because the babies grow here. And he took them out and showed them the dugong. And so what someone said it earlier, it's got to be a root and branch change, systemic change. The local people have to be convinced and then empower their governments, and then what you need is this consensus, and a genuine consensus, and then you need the finance for the countries that can't afford it. And the first world, it's the climate debate, but extended beyond climate to the impacts and the demands of equitable society, just transition, and so on. Tourism has to change, and we heard quickly someone say regenerative aquaculture this morning. There's a new market in tourism, at least in the cruise ships, called regenerative tourism, where the ships don't pollute, they leave some of their profits behind, it doesn't leak back to the big ship companies. They go ashore and they're interested in the culture, because the regenerative tourist doesn't want to be hated by the locals they visit. They want to be seen as helping them with their visit. And so it regenerates the natural, usually they're volunteering for giving money for restoration work. So it regenerates the economy, regenerates the area. And
even the mangrove forests.
Mangroves, seagrass particularly.
Seagrass,
yeah, and it regenerates the tourist. That's why they go. They feel better, and they'll pay for that. So I've seen that now building up in Mexico and colleagues there. So that's ocean energy I've put aside. There's too many wind farm discussions already going in Australia. But the vessel decarbonisation in Fiji and Vanuatu now, it is feasible to decarbonise 10 and 20 horsepower outboard. And their journeys are all short. Then they're moving small amounts of food between villages. And when they get there, they have solar-powered freezers to maintain the food. So we need root and branch, small scale. So that's my examples. And I see you looking at your watch, Chairman. I think I want to summarise by talking about getting back this people concept. I was going to some meeting in Washington last September about ocean accounting, and it sounded so dry to me, but it was with the United States, but the Australian official was from Washington. He's an economist, and I could not believe it when he said our main ambition in Treasury is the well-being of people. I choked, I thought it was money, but I'm being a bit facetious, but you know what I mean. It's our leaders are there for their people. And I've heard that from President Widodo. He switched from illegal fishing. It was very important to him initially. Then he briefed his chief minister to pursue the well-being and poverty alleviation of the coastal people, of which Indonesia has many, many. So well-being, what stops doing all of this? Equitable, we have some cultural issues, such as gender equity and other cultural things. Mexico, my counterpart was explaining they've legislated gender equity into their sustainable ocean plan. They have a feminist gender foreign policy as well. But we're seeing changes. The cultural issues are important, well-being is important, and what I would be thinking is with EORA is a golden opportunity, but you have to address the well-being of the people who are suffering and fighting over stuff they don't need to fight over.
Thank you, my esteemed panelists, and request you all to give them a big hand. Thank you.